Good evening, everyone. If you're in Milwaukee and you're in your car and you turn on the radio, pretty much every other station you're going to listen to this time of year is Christmas music. It's really hard to get away from it. Now, what's defined as Christmas music has a very big definition. And one of the, I don't know if it's a best kept secret or not kept secret at all, is half of or most of the most popular holiday songs are actually written by Jews like Irving Berlin, like Winter Wonderland, Let It Snow, Let It Snow. A lot of those songs aren't specifically about Christmas per se, but some of them definitely are and have a religious context like Oh Holy Night. Now, I've never been in a church or a mass worship service, so I don't know if any of the songs on the radio are part of a religious service in church. But regardless, it's very clear that the songs on the radio are not really intended to be holiday winter music. They're meant to be Christmas time music. Fine. But there's a lot of other music on the radio too that's not necessarily about Christmas, but it's about other topics ranging from the absolutely sublime, like Hallelujah from Leonard Cohen and songs by the Beatles, to the unbelievably inappropriate, which I will not quote here, about sexual violence, drug use, murder, etc., like that. Now, some of that could be described as there is indeed talent behind it. There's biographical nature of it, there's very emotion behind it, but there's a lot of different kinds of music on the radio, and a lot of it could be considered inappropriate one way or the other, either religiously or just in terms of inappropriate content. So the question is there anything in Jewish law that would forbid a Jew to listen to any of this kind of music, either music that has a religious content from another religion, which is kind of the main focus tonight, specifically Christmas, but that would apply if we had a time of year in which there was Hindu music on the radio of a religious nature. But this topic will also expand to songs just in general, secular music that's not specifically by Matisyahu or I Have a Little Dreidel. So how do we deal with songs that don't fit into the Jewish category, secular or music of another religion? But before we get into those sources, there's two important things to mention that we're not going to discuss tonight, even though they might be relevant. The first one, which I didn't bring a source for, is that in the Talmud, the rabbis have a discussion about music in general. And the context of the discussion is, since the destruction of the Second Temple, there's this sadness over the Jewish people. And because of that sadness, we mark it when one builds a house. They don't complete the house. They leave a small part of the house unfinished. And there are dozens of practices that harken back to the desire to get back to the temple, to the Mashiach, Messiah, etc. And one of those practices, according to one rabbi in the Talmud, I think in the section of Gittin, which generally deals with Jewish divorce, is not listening to any music ever. Now, it's really unclear if they mean secular music or music with instruments or just music ever. So would they allow music on Yom Kippur, but not at other times? Regardless, the rabbis developed that, but the reason we're not focusing on it is ultimately the opinion we follow today is the more lenient one, which is music is fine. There are exceptions to that, the time period of the Omer, the 3 weeks before the 9th of Av, but other than that, music in general, with instruments or not, is fine, even though there are some opinions that generally say music is never okay. That's one. Two is a topic we discussed, I think, a few years ago about men, specifically men, not listening to a woman's voice. And I won't go over all of that, but one thing that's very important is women can sing and should sing all they want, but men specifically there's a practice to not listen to a live single woman singing. There are lots of exceptions if she's in a group, if it's a recording, if it's religious music. But because of A, all of those exceptions, and B, that a lot of the music that we're going to talk about happens to be sung by men or whole choirs, again, it's not directly relevant to our topic tonight and isn't an issue, meaning you can deal with both those things. Generally, people listen to music, ultra religious and not. And there's ways to deal with those whose practice is not to listen to a sole woman's voice. Plenty of leniencies that have a lot of acceptance. So before we actually get into our main topic, are there any quick questions on those two things? Even though they're not the main point of tonight, I just dropped a lot of information on you all. So any just very quick clarification questions on those two things? And again, they're classes in and of themselves. Elizabeth, yes. And then I'll just leave you unmuted to take the first source.
Yeah, I was thinking as you're talking about this, how much music we're exposed to without wanting to, not even turning on the radio. You just, walk into a shop and, it's almost all pervasive. So
Yeah. The,
how far do you go to avoiding it if you have to avoid it?
so that actually, we're not going to go specifically into that, but I will say generally, the rabbis pretty much across the board do make a distinction between passive and active listening. So, for example, during the 3 weeks before Tisha B'Av, those weeks of sadness when we don't listen to music at all, or certainly not joyous music, if one is watching the news and there's background music that technically, like, you don't have to mute the news. If you walk into the market and they're playing, music, even if a woman's singing, the rabbis will say, just don't pay it extra attention. So that could be like a sneaky little way for someone who is in a strict community, can't listen to music, be like, oh, I have to go to the Radio Shack. There's no Radio Shack anymore, wherever it is. But generally, the rabbis make that distinction. Now, as I said, there's plenty of room for listening to music in general. But now we're going to talk about music that's not specifically of a religious non-Jewish nature, or music that's just secular in general, not necessarily inappropriate, but just secular in general, i.e. just not Jewish music, not music of Jewish themes, written by Jews, for Jews, etc. So the first part we would generally start a conversation is, does anything in the Torah or the prophets give us a clear answer on this? And no. Music is a huge part throughout the Torah. I mean, the book of Tehillim, of Psalms, of King David and several other authors, are pretty much all musical. And half the words in there that we don't understand, like Mizmor LeDavid, Michtam LeDavid, those are probably musical directions. So music is a huge part of the Torah, clearly a beautiful thing. Now, it doesn't talk about explicitly, the music of the other religions. There is one important thing for the Torah that we're not going to take for granted, because I'll say it now, but we'll take it for granted a little bit. One thing that the Torah is very opposed to is idol worship and avodah zarah. Those are not exactly the same thing. Idol worship is worshiping a being other than God, or believing that a being other than God has power. That is both forbidden for Jews, and this is a very important distinction. Jews in the Torah are supposed to oppose that. Now, I would never go to India into a Hindu temple and smash things for many reasons, out of respect for fellow human beings, etc. Also, that obligation to smash idols doesn't apply outside of the land of Israel. But one is forbidden to engage in any kind of idol worship, and we should distance from it, from the culture around it, the art around it, just anything we can to get away from idol worship. The second thing, which is important, is there's also ways of worshiping God that are not kosher for Jews. For example, Christians believe in God, but the way that they worship God is through a very different means. They believe in, Catholics believe in this Trinity, Protestants a different variation, but ultimately they believe in the God of the Torah, but the way they approach it is very different, and the rabbis make a clear distinction. That is not idolatry. That is not evil should be wiped out, but it is a strange way of worshiping God, and it's forbidden for Jews. Why is that important? Because even if it's not idolatry and we don't think of them as evil, it's still forbidden for Jews. So any idolatry, worshiping anything we believe to be other than God, or other religions that do believe in God but do it in a way that's different from Jews, all forbidden, and we should stay away from it. That idea will become very important very shortly. Again, the idea that not only can we not do idolatry or this strange kind of worship, but we distance ourselves from it. So we don't really have anything else in the Torah relevant until we get to the Talmud. And Elizabeth, the first source we get that will come back in our last source is a section in the Talmud that doesn't really get explicated, meaning it doesn't become law. It becomes quoted in a few places, but it's not really where our conversation begins. It just is kind of where it ends. So Elizabeth, this first source, which seems like this is exactly what we're talking about, but nobody really picks it up. So please, source number one.
The Gemara explains, Acher, what was his...
Oh, sorry, pause for a second. Acher in Hebrew means the other one, but it's a kind of a derogatory nickname for this probably brilliant man, Elisha ben Avuya, and he, in the Talmud, went off the path. He left the people, left the religion. If he was alive today, he'd probably be modern Orthodox, if anything. But there wasn't that option, so he became a heretic to the point where they didn't even say his name. But again, he himself was probably brilliant beyond compare. I believe he was a student of Rabbi Akiva, and that's partly why it's so painful for the rabbis of the Talmud, because he was one of their own. He was, a gifted sage, and for them to lose him to the greater culture was deeply painful. Now, did he actually stop believing in God and all that? It's not clear. But the rabbis were not a fan of the way that he went a different path. So that's Acher, and they're going to have at least one opinion for what led him astray. Sorry, please continue.
What was his failing? Greek tunes never ceased from his mouth. He would constantly hum Greek songs, even when he was among the sages. This shows that from the outset, he was drawn to Gentile culture and beliefs. Similarly, they said about Acher, when he would stand after learning in the study hall, many heretical books, which he had been reading, would fall from his lap. Therefore, he was somewhat unsound, even among the sages.
Excellent, thank you. So what one would expect is a source like this, which is very explicit, would then turn into, the rabbis commenting on the Talmud would say, well, then we are not allowed to sing songs of any non-Jew. We cannot engage in their culture at all, but that's not what happens. And there's many possible reasons for that. One is because this is not written as a legal source. It does not say that if they had followed up in the Talmud, therefore we do not listen to these kinds of songs, that'd be one thing. But it seems to just be a description about this person. And it becomes more an either attack or explanation of what happened to Elisha ben Abuya than a general attack on foreign culture. Now, there are plenty of things in the Talmud where they have issues with foreign culture and not engaging with, but the reality is the rabbis of the Talmud engage with the other cultures in their philosophy, in their dress, in their music, etc. So this case is kind of an outlier and doesn't really get picked up. Again, it would make so much sense if we could just go from this to the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam, who would say, based on the source, we don't listen to secular music, end of story. That's not what happens. Now, as I said, it will get picked up again a couple thousand years later in our last source, but our real conversation actually starts a few centuries later in the pre-medieval times. So Leon, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And actually, before I have you read this first source, are there any questions up until now? And welcome, Jerry, and welcome, Susan, and welcome, Ken. Beautiful. So this first source here is Rav Chai Gaon. So this is from after the Talmud was finished, like the 5th, 6th, 7th century. Then for the 8th, 9th, 10th century, the Jewish world was basically led, at least the intellectual Jewish world, by these academies in Sura and Pumbedita, which were around, like the Middle East, Iraq, something like that. Rav Chai Gaon, Gaon means a genius, so his name was probably Chai, so he was Rabbi Chai the genius, was the head of the academy in Pumbedita in the 10th century. And he wrote philosophical works, all the Gaonim. You've heard of Saadia Gaon. Again, Gaon is not their last name. It's a title of respect. And Rav Chai Gaon wrote many different works on legal works as well. And one of his opinions, and again, it's his opinion, is that he is extremely opposed to music, non-Jewish music. And he describes it here with some very interesting phraseology, and we'll come back to it and unpack it in the following sources. So Leon, source number 2. It actually should be source number 1 in section B, but that's not a big deal. Please.
Songs of love of one person for another, and to praise a beautiful person for their beauty, and to praise a hero for his heroism and the like those of the Ishmaelites, which are called Ashar al-Ghazal.
So there's a lot going on here. And one thing that I'll say before we get into really the next 5 sources is there's a lot of censorship. There's a lot of words that were probably different around, talking about whether it's Muslims or Arabs or Christians, et cetera. A lot of words that got shifted around by censors when the Jews said the music of such and such people, whatever they actually said, is inappropriate. Then the censors of that people came along and said, no, we're going to put a different phrase here. So he may have said Ishmaelites, which is generally code for Muslims, because that was probably their, generally their closest neighbor. They were engaged with that culture. And Jews and Muslims, at least for a long period of our history, often got along very well. The Golden Age, some of the greatest rabbis in our history lived among Muslims and were friends with them, etc. But Rav Chai Gaon was aware of this secular music, meaning it wasn't Yom Kippur music, it wasn't Shabbos music, it was love songs. And some of the sources I didn't bring here unpacks it and says the kind of songs that you wouldn't even sing in a mosque. These are the songs that they would sing in taverns, pop songs, the stuff, if they had radio, this is what you'd hear on the radio. And in fact, many, many, many of the songs to this day that we hear on the radio are love songs. And he says that this kind of secular music, love songs, are inappropriate and should not be sung by anybody. Just as a blanket statement, we should stay away from these songs. It's inappropriate for Jews. Now, that is one extreme. We're going to look back how the pendulum swings back and forth until we end up at a pretty good compromise. But Rav Chai Gaon is very opposed to these secular love songs, and he speaks Arabic as well. So he gives us the phrase Ashar al-Ghazal, which I don't know how to translate it, except that I know it basically means love songs. So we're going to see that idea picked up not much later in the 11th century by Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi. He wrote probably one of the three most important commentaries on the Talmud. And he also spoke Arabic, which will become very important in a moment. So Gloria and Leonard, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And here's a very important thing that's about to happen and why I named this section Adon Olam and La Marseillaise. I'm not how to pronounce it exactly, but what's going to happen now, the conversation for a few hundred years or so about secular music isn't really about singing it in general. It's about bringing it into synagogues and using those melodies to enhance the service, or potentially even to sing them amongst the service. I haven't seen that so much. We've definitely, the reason I brought this is someone had mentioned that I believe Jim Gallin, Oliver Shalom, was doing Adon Olam to Marseillaise, which is the French national anthem. So Adon Olam Asher Malach B'Terem Kol Yetzir Nivra. So that's Adon Olam is a Jewish song, but the French national anthem is very much a secular song. It's not religious in nature, but the question is, should these melodies and songs of other religions or just secular ones in general, do they have any place inside of our synagogue? So that's where the next sources are going to discuss, and then they're going to expand it to outside of the synagogue. But we're going to spend a lot of time inside the synagogue, as it were. So our conversation really starts, and again, most of the conversation happens in the medieval age. Doesn't happen in the Talmudic age, doesn't really happen amongst the Gaonim pre-medieval. 95% of what we care about tonight, to answer our question, is among medieval rabbis and the arguments that they have from two extreme positions. So Gloria, source number one, in the response of the Refo, it's not his direct commentary on the Talmud, but it's among his writings. Please, a chazan whom they heard. And it starts with the question, and then he gives, or I give part of his answer.
Question, a chazan whom they heard is behaving improperly. For example, that he is singing Ishmaelite songs and the like. Do they remove him or not? Responsum. A Shalia Tzibor or cantor who utters from his mouth improper things, such as obscenities, and sings Ishmaelite songs, they remove him. About such things it is said, Jeremiah, it cried out against me. Therefore have I hated it.
Excellent, thank you. Now, a few things that are not clear from this. When he talks about a chazan singing these Ishmaelite songs, which we'll come back to that in a moment, it's not clear if he's, again, doing this thing where he's doing Adon Olam to the melody of this non-Jewish song, or if they, saw him sitting in his car singing House of the Rising Sun by the Animals. I don't know who would be sitting in their car singing that at the top of their lungs to their son. That'd be a crazy thing. But the question is, those are two very different things. So it's three options. One is, he's doing Jewish songs to non-Jewish melodies, or he's literally sitting in shul singing Strawberry Fields Forever or Frank Sinatra or Elvis Presley, or they just see him in the tavern singing non-Jewish songs. And again, they're not talking about just a regular Jew. They're talking specifically about a chazan, a cantor, who represents the Jews and comes to speak for them before God. So with that, those uncertainties, what we're going to see is the rabbis of the next centuries kind of unpack it and interpret it in different ways. But the first thing that's important is when the Rif says Ishmaelite songs, it is almost certainly a censorship thing, because even though Ishmael, who was kind of the classic ancestor of the Muslim people, of the Arab-speaking people, by quoting a Torah person, it kind of makes it a little bit distant. That's probably not who he was talking about, and we know that because a few centuries later, a famous work by Rabbi Vlunel, the Orchot Chaim, quotes the Rif, and he uses a different language, and it's very likely, there's a lot of evidence that this quote, this tiny little line, Gloria, I'll let you take it in source number 2, is probably what the Rif actually said before it was later censored, probably a few centuries after he wrote it. So Gloria, just that very short source number 2.
Who sings Arab songs, which are called Bashar al-Arab.
This would be like me coming out with a response online that's saying all of these, go to Fonz FM, which is, usually oldies, but I think it's Christmas music now, or maybe not, but one of those oldie stations we have, and saying that all of the Christmas songs written by the Christians are forbidden. That would be deeply offensive. But if I said any song written by pagans about any pagan holidays, and all of us knew, wink, wink, I'm talking about Christmas, even though we know what we're talking about, it'd be less offensive. It's probably what happened. The Rif most likely was saying the Arab pop songs, Arab love songs are forbidden and inappropriate for Chazan. Again, we don't know exactly when or where, but the censor said, let's make it a little less offensive. But the reason that's important is it's very likely that the Rif was uncomfortable with secular love songs. And the reason that's important is because a lot of people are going to interpret what he said very differently. But again, there's ample evidence and multiple other sources that I didn't bring that the Rif was almost certainly talking about secular love songs being inappropriate, which if it's true that secular love songs are inappropriate, then we're in a lot of trouble. A lot of music, Springsteen, even though he just made $550 million, we couldn't listen to most of his music. But if you jump actually back in time a little bit to the 13th century, this incredibly important work, Sefer Hasidim, which is a collection of different customs and laws, and it's been very authoritative in the development of Jewish law from the 13th century onwards, talks about the kinds of music that it is inappropriate for people to sing. And it's clear that he is part of the tradition going back to the Rif, but the kind of music that he says is inappropriate has nothing to do with this Bashar al-Arab, which I think someone pointed out as probably already a misspelling of the act. If you asked an Arab speaker, they'd say, oh, that's not how you pronounce it. It's probably like Ashar al-Arab or something like that. But again, up till now, secular love songs, not okay. Sefer Hasidim is going to go in a very different direction. And again, because of what the Rif, the version of the Rif he might have seen, which said the songs of the Ishmaelites, i.e. another religion, and just songs that we find inappropriate, it kind of leaves the door open to, well, what's inappropriate about this music? Because he didn't see the version that said secular love songs. He just knows there's a kind of music from another religion that's not okay. So Leonard, in source number 3, he says, and a person, please.
And a person who has a pleasant voice should be careful not to sing foreign or Gentile melodies, for it's a sin. And for this, he was created with a pleasant voice, to praise his creator and not for sin.
Excellent. So one of the ideas, so this isn't explicit, it'll come out more in some of the later sources, is the idea here is he is against secular melodies of another religion, but what he's hinting at is it's not just secular love songs. He doesn't talk about that at all. He talks about songs that are written for idol worshipers or for other religions, and that's going to become unpacked very much so. You'll see in the next couple of sources, but we're going to see a shift here, again, because early on, the issue was with just any non-Jewish music. And there's lots of evidence that it was specifically like this kind of love song, something inappropriate about it. But now we're going to see a shift to, it's not just non-Jewish music, it's non-Jewish music that happens to be about idolatry. So this next source here from the 16th century, the Arugat Bosem from Padua, he actually talks about specifically inside of a synagogue of these cantors, these chazanim, that are bringing not the words of these non-religious, non-Jewish melodies, but just the melodies themselves. And he is very, very much against it. So Susan, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And if you would read the source number for Arugat Bosem from Padua.
I have to ask, have I been guilty of Lashon Hara here? Because I was the one who made the comment about the Marseillaise.
No, not at all.
Okay,
Not at
okay,
all.
Okay, all right, well.
I think it's great. It's a great teaching moment. No. As we'll find out, what he did is perfectly fine. That's a hint for the end of the class, but we haven't gotten there yet.
Thinking about Ma'oz Tzur, the melody, we sing that too. But anyway, and what can we say and how shall we justify ourselves regarding some of the cantors of our generation who chant the holy prayers to the tunes of popular secular songs, and thus while engaging in sacred speech, they think of profanity and nakedness.
Excellent, thank you. So what we really seen here is we really actually haven't seen the shift so much. The Sefer Hasidim kind of hinted at this idolatry thing, but for the most part, the issue here has really been secular music. And we've seen that all the way from really the 10th century through the 16th century, both the songs themselves hinted at, or not hinted at, but basically as the Orchot Chaim and the Sefer Hasidim kind of say, and certainly other sources. And the Arugat Bosem says it's not even just the words, even the melodies of this secular music. So to sing, an Elvis Presley melody, Adon Olam to an Elvis Presley melody. So even if you leave out the lyrics about, baby, I love you, or whatever it is like that, you leave out the words, the fact that those melodies are associated with, ooh, I want to hold your hand, that's not appropriate in synagogue. So a couple of important things here that we've established is the conversation has really been about secular love songs and how they're inappropriate. And we've seen 2 times, the early conversation was just never really sing them. And then it kind of shifts to just don't use their melodies or their words inside of synagogue when you're a chazan. But again, we haven't, I kind of spoke a little too soon. We haven't really gotten into the idol worship thing here. We've really established the idea of secular love songs being inappropriate in general, and certainly for a chazan in synagogue. So now we're actually going to get to more what I was talking about, a shift in what's wrong with these songs, and it leads to an incredible leniency that kind of applies today. So any questions up until now? Excellent. All right, Ken, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you for this next section. Beautiful. So we're still here kind of in the conversation about being in synagogue and chazan and what melodies they're allowed to bring in, which, Ken, to you and I, you being the gabbai, being the rabbi, is very relevant to us. But again, this conversation is going to set up an incredibly important leniency and the rules that help define in general what's appropriate and not appropriate to listen to in terms of music. So the first really major leniency that everyone kind of just jumps on the bandwagon and says, you know what, I agree with that, is in the work of the Beit Chadash, Rabbi Yoel Sirkis, not the juggler Circus, but he's from Poland. And in one of his responsa, in source number 1, Ken, please.
Sure, but go back to the previous one just a little bit.
Sure.
Whoever's making that comment is assuming that if people do this, they will definitely be thinking of profanities and nakedness. So I mean, you could question someone saying, "Oh, I know what you're thinking," because that always gets my hackles up, so to speak. But we'll pass on that. We'll go on anyway here. So
I will just say that going back to one of the original things I said about idolatry is, let's say, for example, I have no intention to worship an idol, and if I went into a store that had books on idolatry, I personally, Joel Dinan, would not be I wouldn't want to do idolatry. However, there are many people who might get inspired by it. So the rabbis, this phrase "lo plug," they don't make a distinction. They just say that no Jew should go into a store where they sell idolatry or read books on idolatry. Now, we learned in our class on forbidden books, there are appropriate times to learn books that may have words or ideas in them of an idolatrous nature. But in general, the rabbis just say, even if some people can deal with it and some people can't, better safe than sorry. That's like a very good rabbinic philosophy is better safe than sorry. Whether or not that's the right answer and the best philosophy, that is the philosophy. So even though some people might think of Beatles music and not be inspired by it in that way, some people will, and they just say it's just not appropriate. And again, we also, these Arab love songs that they were originally referring to, if we actually heard them, they might have been much more sexual in nature. Think about Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim. It's an incredibly erotic love poem, and it's almost certainly influenced by the literature of its period. So it might be these rabbis are talking about, don't read erotic poetry or sing erotic poetry. They weren't familiar with just the innocuous pop songs that we have today that are about nothing and harmless. However, the specifically Ashkenazi rabbis, dealt with a lot of Sephardi ones, but a lot of the Ashkenazi one are going to say, no, it's not about secular music. That's not the kind of music that's forbidden. Go ahead, Ken, source number one.
Okay, what they sing in synagogues, melodies which they, the Christians, sing in the house of prayer, it seems that it's not forbidden except precisely those melodies which are specific to idol worships. Since it is a law for idol worship, but if they are not specifically for idol worship, it seems that there is no prohibition, which I guess goes back to your first thing about idol worship, way back at the beginning.
And there's a few important things to unpack here. One, why are they, I mean, he doesn't actually say Christians here, and again, that might be a censorship thing. But if he's referring to Christians, which he likely is, that's probably because he was living amongst Christians, and they were the religion which there was a very unfortunate long history of hatred and certainly a lot of attacks on the Jews. Now, and there are indeed opinions that say that Christianity, because they essentially worship somebody who was a man, who was, as far as I'm concerned, was still a man and a man who died, they would see that as a form of idolatry. Now, generally, many rabbis today would say, no, it's not that they're worshiping idols, it's that it's this forbidden kind of worship of Avodah Zarah. They still believe in God, they're just doing it in a way in which Jews can't. Regardless, their music represents something which is forbidden to us. So the reason I'm saying that is that today, the Bach might have thought that Christians were evil idolaters. I don't know, you'd have to read all of his works. But today, the way we approach this is Christianity is forbidden for Jews. Fine. And the music that is specifically Christian, specifically religious worship music of Christians is what is forbidden music, not these love songs, etc., like that. And we actually see that borne out in the next couple of sources. So Tamar, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And this next source, we're in the 17th century or the mid 1600s, the Shulchan Aruch. And this opinion is actually mostly from the Ashkenazi Ramah, but it starts with, we do not remove, so the context is a chazan, if he does something inappropriate, he's incapable of doing his job, or we find out something, just inappropriate about what he's doing. And when do we say you can't be the chazan anymore? Tamar, bevakasha.
We do not remove a chazan from his job unless we find in him some disqualifications, Rima, and a prayer leader who fouls his mouth, i.e. uses foul language, or sings non-Jewish songs. We warn him not to do this, and if he does not listen, he removes himself.
Excellent, thank you. And by the way, the Hebrew...
Page 125, Amud Arba.
Thank you. So the phrase here that he uses for these non-Jewish songs, B'shirei HaNochrim, so in Hebrew, Notzrim is usually the phrase for Christians, but Nochrim here often refers specifically to Christianity. And again, if the Jews had lived in India, they probably would have, I don't know what the history would have been like, but Hinduism or Buddhism would have been the religions that they would have dealt with, but they knew Christianity, so they dealt with Christianity. And what's interesting here is, again, he doesn't talk about idolatry or anything like that. He just says the songs of the non-Jews. So what is very important is not only this source number one from the Bach, but also the next two sources, the 17th century, this Magen Avraham, Rabbi Avraham Gombiner, and the way that he understands these non-Jewish songs. And tomorrow, I'll let you take it. He couldn't be any more explicit about what are non-Jewish songs. So please, source number three.
A cantor who sings Gentile songs, in other words, with a melody which they use for idol worship.
Excellent, thank you. Tamar, why don't you take source number four? Now, 20th century, the Mishnah Berurah, Rabbi the Chafetz Chaim, Rabbi Yisrael Meir HaKohen, and he is incredibly authoritative to this day. To this day, like many questions that even you, my congregants, would ask me, often I'll look at the Mishnah Berurah and his commentaries there. So please, source number 4.
The songs of the Christians. This means songs that they sing for their worship. And the Bach in his Teshuvah writes that this refers to songs, specifically to songs which are especially for this kind of worship.
Excellent. So now we have 2 very important narratives. And in many ways, they go back to that, not the first rabbi, but one of the first rabbis we looked at, the Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, the Rif, and how he says there are songs from the non-Jews. He talks about Yishmaelites, but essentially the non-Jews that are inappropriate. And you get 2 different stories here. One story, which really goes back to kind of Rabbi Chai Gaon, is it just means secular love songs. Now, none of them just say songs about, the answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind or anything like that. They do use the phrase, this Bashar al-Arab, Asher al-Ghazal, these songs of love, which probably have an erotic, inappropriate nature. But there are plenty of pop songs on the radio. You don't have to go far to hear a song about a woman's body or what a man wants to do to it. So that's certainly a significant portion of the music out there would fit the definition of these inappropriate love songs. So what you have is a long tradition of these love songs are inappropriate in general. Just don't ever sing them, stay away from them, and certainly don't listen to them on the radio. The reason we don't have that language is because they didn't have radios. The way that they engaged with them is to know the songs and sing them in taverns when they're drunk. Just don't sing those songs. Don't engage with them at all, A. And certainly don't use the melodies of those inappropriate songs in a synagogue. But then you have a shift. Again, the Rif wasn't 100% clear, at least in the versions we have, about why those songs were problematic. So then you get, in the 16th century, 17th century, the songs that are inappropriate are not love songs, they're songs about idol worship and idolatry of a specifically religious nature. And why is that important? Because that becomes the mainstream ruling in the Shulchan Aruch and all of its commentaries. So this whole thing about secular love songs falls away. Even though we have a long tradition of it, that doesn't become the mainstream opinion. The mainstream opinion is listening to music, and I think, again, the Mishnah Berurah said it really well, the songs they sing, le avodat yolim, specifically for their worship. So there's even some room here to say that a song that says about, it's Christmas time, that's just a song for the radio, and no Christian ever would or ever has sung it in church, might not fit into that category of forbidden music. But what everyone seems to agree on at this point in history is music that is specifically written about something forbidden for the Jews, i.e. another religion and their worship, and it's used for that purpose. Not only can Jews not sing it, Jews can't listen to it, and this is a very important one, they cannot use those melodies for their services. So if you hear, and the rabbis do talk about this in sources I don't bring, so if there's a song that a famous composer, Bach or something, wrote a melody for specifically a Christian hymn, one could not take that melody and then use it for Lecha Dodi on Friday night. That would be inappropriate and forbidden. But Bach wrote plenty of secular music that was just beautiful and arias and stuff like that. According to all these opinions, I could take any music that's not specifically religious in nature and do whatever I want with it. I could sing it, I can listen to it, and I can use it for melodies in shul. So the La Marseillaise, absolutely fine for Adon Olam. And a great proof of this, Ken could probably speak to this more than I could, is Napoleon's March. Chabad Hasidim, which have a very, very strong sense of defining their culture and not being part of the general culture, have this long history of taking secular melodies and using them for their prayers. And for them, it's actually very important. For them, it's the idea of taking something which is secular and raising it up to be kadosh, to be for a holy purpose. But they would never take a melody that's specifically written for Christian worship. And again, we've been focusing entirely on Christianity because that's the context of these rabbis. But if you said this song was written for Hindu worship or an ancient Greek worship, Homer, the Odyssey would have used it, then we can't listen to it, can't sing it, can't listen to it, and certainly can't use it for our prayers. And all of this comes full circle in this last source, and then we'll open it up for questions, by Rav Moshe Feinstein, 20th century New York, even though he's from Eastern Europe. And what's interesting is his opinion might seem rather strict at first, and he makes one statement in there that definitely raises my eyebrows, but his relatively strict opinion here is actually incredibly lenient and opens the door to be able to access so much of the corpus of music, and it'll help us answer our question about listening to Christmas music on the radio and just all music on the radio. So he says, behold, the melodies that the Christians sing in their house of worship, certainly it's forbidden to hear them on the radio and even on a phonograph. So you could see when he was writing, and not only the melodies that are sung now, but even what they used to sing long ago, even though they have now stopped singing those melodies, they are forbidden. So he also kind of expands it to saying, today some of their old worship songs might have become, more innocuous for general pop use. And he says, nope, those are always forbidden because they were originally associated with their worship. And he says not listening to them, and all the more so using them in our shul for our melodies. He goes on. And also the melody that some Christian composed for a verse of Psalms is forbidden. So even a psalm, which is a Jewish prayer, if they composed a melody for their Christian worship, and that's important. If I have a friend who's non-Jewish and he says, can I write you a melody to use at Lake Park Synagogue, and it's only for you because it sounds Jewish, that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about non-Jews writing melodies, even with texts that we both agree on, but for their worship. For a verse of Psalms is forbidden because the melodies that Christians compose to verses of Psalms are intended for their prayers, which is forbidden. So again, this is very, very specific. Now he continues, and if he recognizes that the author of the melody did not intend to sing for their worship, but to sing in general for the sake of enjoying the singing, even though the composer of the song is a Christian, there's no prohibition. So certainly Irving Berlin is fine. And this next quote here is the one where I raise my eyebrow. And by the way, he doesn't insist on this. I just disagree that this is true, but he doesn't say that this is always true. He says, but in general, it must be assumed that it's for their worship and forbidden, and even to earn a living, it's forbidden. Now, here he's not talking about the Beatles and stuff like that. He's talking about, stuff that, just might be written by Christians, or I'm not really sure exactly what he means here. He might just mean pop music. But again, plenty of Christmas music is not written, probably most of it is not written for any kind of worship, and has very little connection, certainly being written by Jews, very little connection to the religious nature of the holiday of Christmas. And now, talking about full circle, he mentions the first source we started with. And in Chagiga 15, where Shmuel explained that a man great in Torah, such as Acher, Elisha ben Abuya, became an infidel because Greek song did not cease from his lips. And the commentary of Rashi is surprising, so it goes off a different direction. And therefore, the Maharsha concludes that Elisha sang songs of idol worshippers, which is a prohibition of idol worship, which belongs to heresy. And that's so funny because the first source in the Talmud didn't really imply that it was because of idolatry, more that it was just, culture that was not Jewish. Regardless, by Rav Moshe and all the rabbis before him, I don't want to say misunderstanding or misinterpreting the original intention, but by limiting it to something so specific, they've actually created a great leniency, which is that all music that is not of a specifically religious nature to a forbidden religion is okay. Now, I'm going to amend that statement to say that there's a general, I should have even brought a source here. There's a general law or practice of the rabbis that things which are just really inappropriate should never be listened to. So if someone says, Rabbi, can I listen to Strawberry Fields? It's just one of my favorite songs, Strawberry Fields Forever. Sure, why not? Rabbi, can I listen to a hip hop song that's about violating multiple people, murder and drugs? No. And that's not about listening to non-Jewish music. That's just because it's inappropriate. And Jews should shield their eyes from such inappropriate things. So that's kind of another conversation. But in general, secular music, including Let It Snow, Let It Snow, Let It Snow, and even songs that might even be about Christmas, but were written specifically to be pop songs just for fun, strictly speaking, can a Jew listen to them? Yes. Should a Jew listen to them? Well, that's not my job. I'm not a rabbi here to tell you what you should and shouldn't do. But in general, Christmas music, the way that it has been written, marketed, and used, would be okay. Even though Rav Moshe again kind of hints that he assumes the worst, that's not the reality. The reality is that most Christmas music on the radio was written for fun. Now, if there's a song like "Oh Holy Night" that was written as a religious worship song and then made it to popular, then strictly speaking, it would not be appropriate to listen to or sing that song. So one would have to kind of look into it. But Jingle Bells, Let It Snow, There's No Place Like Home for the Holidays, I can see no reason to forbid that. And certainly, we can enjoy it. And then all the more so, secular music of just a lovely nature. The Answer, My Friend, Is Blowing in the Wind, and Paul Simon, still crazy after all these years. I'm just trying to think of older songs that more people will know, but all that stuff would be okay. But if you get like a pop song from a female that talks about whatever she might talk about, there are sources that would forbid that, not because it's non-Jewish music, but simply because it's inappropriate. And that's a class in and of itself. But can we generally listen to secular music? And can we use melodies from Simon and Garfunkel and Bruce Springsteen and make a Lachado D on it? The answer is generally, yeah, go for it. And there were dozens of cool sources I saw from Chazanim and theater, people in theater who said, this is what everyone does and it's perfectly fine as long as it's not connected specifically to the religious worship of other religions. And that is not an attack on other religions. That is simply distancing ourselves from something which is forbidden for us.